Ruth, we think it's best if you skip Christmas dinner at our house this year. The dining room will be at capacity, and honestly, your hearing problems make conversation awkward for everyone. Those words from Charlotte, my daughter-in-law, cut deeper than the sharpest knife, but they ignited a flame inside me I thought had been extinguished years ago. That painful rejection became the catalyst for the most meaningful holiday celebration I've experienced in 20 years. Before we continue, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. And if this story touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've got something extraordinary to share with you. They say blood makes you related, but love makes you family. This is the story of how I reclaimed my Christmas, rediscovered my voice, and realized that at 70 years old, I wasn't just Victor's mother, Lily and Noah's grandmother, or Thomas's widow. I was Ruth Wilson, and I still had gifts worth sharing. Was born Ruth Ann Kavanaugh in the spring of 1955 in a small town called Pinewood that few people could locate on a map. My father owned the local pharmacy, and my mother taught piano from our sunroom. We weren't wealthy by conventional standards, but we were rich in the ways that truly mattered. A home filled with music and stories, hands that were always ready to help, and a table that welcomed anyone who needed a place to belong. The measure of a life well lived isn't in what you have, Ruthie, but in what you give, my mother would say as we prepared meals together, flour dusting her apron and wisdom shining in her eyes. I learned early that creating spaces where people felt valued was its own kind of art, as legitimate and beautiful as any painting hanging in a gallery. I met Thomas Wilson during my first year teaching elementary school. He was the new pediatrician in town, tall and thoughtful with eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. We quite literally bumped into each other at the library. I was carrying a stack of picture books for my second graders, and he was returning medical journals. The collision sent books tumbling across the polished floor, and as we scrambled to gather them, our hands touched over the Velveteen Rabbit. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice gentle despite his imposing height. Those kind eyes studied me with such warmth that I felt my cheeks flush. "I'm Thomas." "Ruth," I replied, suddenly aware of my sensible shoes and the chalk dust likely clinging to my cardigan. "But everyone calls me Ruthie." That chance meeting blossomed into cups of tea at the corner cafe, walks through autumn leaves, and eventually a simple solitaire diamond that Thomas had saved 3 months to afford. "It's not very grand," he apologized as he slipped it onto my finger. "But one day I promise you'll have everything you deserve." I looked into those earnest eyes and knew with absolute certainty that I already had everything I could ever want. We married in the summer of 1977 in my parents' garden. My mother strung fairy lights through the old maple tree, and my father built a simple wooden arch where we exchanged our vows. My wedding dress was ivory lace that had been my grandmother's, carefully altered to suit my shorter frame. Thomas wore a navy suit he'd bought for his medical school graduation, a spring of baby's breath in his lapel. We started our life together in a modest apartment near the elementary school where I taught and the clinic where Thomas worked. Our furniture was mostly secondhand. A wobbly dining table my father had reinforced, a sofa with slightly worn armrests from Thomas's aunt, mismatched chairs we'd painted the same shade of blue to create some harmony. Those early years were lean, but joyful. We saved diligently, cooking simple meals at home and finding happiness in free pleasures. Walks in the town park, board games by lamplight when we were conserving electricity, Sunday afternoon picnics by the river, when others our age were buying new cars or taking vacations to exotic destinations. We put every extra dollar into our dream, a home of our own where we could raise a family and build a legacy of love and acceptance. In 1980, we welcomed Victor into the world. I can still recall the weight of him in my arms, so impossibly small, yet somehow containing the entire universe. Thomas stood beside the hospital bed, tears streaming unashamedly down his face. "Look what we made, Ruthie," he whispered, voice thick with emotion. "Look at our son." Victor had Thomas's dark curls and my stubborn chin. From his earliest days, he showed a determination that both delighted and exhausted us. When he learned to walk, he refused any helping hand, tumbling again and again onto our carpeted floor, only to push himself back up with renewed purpose. When he learned to read, he insisted on finishing entire books in one sitting, even as his small eyelids grew heavy with sleep. "He's going to make a mark on this world," Thomas would say proudly, watching Victor meticulously organize his toy cars or carefully count the coins in his ceramic piggy bank. "Our boy is going places." By the time Victor started school, Thomas's medical practice had flourished enough for us to make a down payment on a Victorian house on Cedar Lane. It wasn't perfect. The kitchen needed updating, the plumbing was temperamental, and the garden had grown wild with neglect. But to us, it was a palace. I planted rose bushes along the front walkway and hung curtains I'd sewn myself in every window. Thomas spent weekends replacing floorboards and painting walls, whistling as he worked. We filled that house with love, with dreams, with the noise, and beautiful chaos of family life. I continued teaching second grade at Pinewood Elementary, just a few blocks from our home. The salary wasn't impressive, but the hours meant I could be present when Victor returned from school, and the summer breaks allowed precious time together as a family. Thomas built his pediatric practice, becoming beloved by families throughout our community for his gentle manner and thorough care. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable. We had health insurance, a reliable station wagon, and enough extra to start a college fund for Victor. Every summer, we took a modest vacation, a week at a lakeside cabin, camping in the state park, and once, after saving for 3 years, a magical trip to Disney World. Victor would bounce with excitement for weeks beforehand, helping to pack the car and tracing our route on the road atlas with a highlighter pen. As Victor grew, I watched, with a mixture of pride and wistfulness as he developed his own identity, separate from ours. The little boy who once followed Thomas around the yard with a toy stethoscope, mimicking his every move, became a teenager with opinions and interests all his own. He joined the debate team in high school, discovered a passion for constitutional law, and set his sights on prestigious pre-law programs. "Just like his mother," I'd say to Thomas, watching Victor articulate his arguments at the kitchen table. Thomas would shake his head, smiling. "More ambitious, though. He won't stop at teaching or a small-town practice. He's got bigger plans." There was no bitterness in Thomas's voice, only pride and a deep, abiding hope that his son would have opportunities beyond what we had known. Thomas had sacrificed his dream of a specialized medical career to establish his practice in our small town, ensuring stability for our family. He never spoke of it as a loss, but I knew it was one of his few regrets. When Victor was accepted to Westlake University with a partial scholarship, Thomas and I embraced each other and cried after Victor went to bed. The scholarship would help, but we still faced 4 years of tuition payments that would strain our resources considerably. Without hesitation, Thomas took on additional patients and extended his office hours. I started tutoring after school and selling hand-knitted items at the local craft fair. "We'll manage," Thomas assured me when I fretted over our thinning savings. "This is what we've worked for all these years." And we did manage, though it meant postponing home repairs, cutting back on everything non-essential, and working more hours than our bodies sometimes wanted to give. The day we drove Victor to college, helping him unpack in a dormitory room that seemed impossibly small for our tall, lanky son, I felt a complex mixture of emotions, pride and fear and loss, and hope all tangled together in my heart. "Call us. Anytime," I told him, straightening his bedspread for the 3rd time. "Day or night. And come home whenever you can." "I will, Mom," he promised, though I could see his eyes were already looking beyond us toward the new life waiting just outside. The door. Thomas squeezed my hand as we walked back to the car. "He'll be fine, Ruthie. We raised him right." Victor thrived at Westlake. His natural eloquence and analytical mind opened doors to internships, leadership positions in campus organizations, and a circle of friends from affluent, well-connected families. When he came home for holidays, he spoke a new language of case law, constitutional amendments, and judicial precedents. His clothes became more expensive, his tastes more refined, his stories filled with names and places that seemed to belong to a world I could barely imagine. It was during his senior year that he brought Charlotte home for Christmas. She was striking, tall and slender with sleek auburn hair and clothes that looked like they belonged in a magazine. She studied international business, spoke fluent French, and had spent a semester abroad in Paris. Her father was a federal judge. In Boston, her mother a curator at the Museum of Fine Arts. Next to her, I felt suddenly conscious of my practical boots and the laugh lines around my eyes that had deepened since Thomas's health had begun to decline. "Your home is so charming," she said, looking around our living room with its comfortable but worn furniture, the family photos on every surface, the hand-crocheted throws draped over the sofa. "It's like stepping into a Norman Rockwell painting." I wasn't sure if it was a compliment, but I chose to take it as one. "Thomas and I believe a home should be lived in, not just looked at," I replied, offering her more cranberry chutney. "Charlotte's family just renovated their Cape Cod summer house," Victor said quickly. "It was featured in Architectural Digest." "How lovely," I said, though I'd never heard of the magazine. "I'd love to see photos sometime." Throughout the meal, I watched my son, the way he looked at Charlotte, the way he seemed to hang on her every word, the way he subtly corrected his grammar and table manners in her presence. It wasn't that I disliked her. She was polite, intelligent, clearly ambitious. But I couldn't help feeling that when Victor looked at her, he saw a future that had no place for his past. After they left, Thomas found me in the kitchen washing dishes with more vigor than necessary. "She seems nice," he offered, picking up a dish towel. "She's perfect," I said, scrubbing at a stubborn spot on the roasting pan. "Beautiful, educated, sophisticated. Everything I'm not." Thomas set down the towel and turned me to face him, his hands gentle on my shoulders. "Ruth Wilson, you stop that right now. You are the most beautiful, intelligent, loving woman I've ever known. If our son is lucky, Charlotte will have half your character." I leaned into his solid warmth, grateful beyond words for this man who had stood beside me for so many years, who still looked at me as if I were the young teacher he'd met in the library, even as time etched its marks on both our faces. Victor and Charlotte married 2 years later in a lavish ceremony at an historic mansion that Charlotte's parents rented for the occasion. The guest list included partners from Victor's law firm, Charlotte's sorority sisters, and various connections from both their professional networks. Thomas and I sat in the front row, feeling somewhat out of place amid the designer suits and cocktail dresses. "Just smile and be yourself," Thomas whispered, adjusting his tie for the dozenth time. "We are the parents of the groom. We have every right to be here." The ceremony was beautiful, but impersonal, with none of the warmth or character that had marked our garden wedding all those years ago. I missed the personal touches, the sense of family and community, but Victor looked happy, and in the end, that was all that mattered. As the years passed, Victor and Charlotte built their life together, climbing steadily upward in both their careers. They bought a modern condominium in the downtown area, then upgraded to a larger home in an exclusive neighborhood when Victor made junior partner at his firm. They traveled extensively, ski trips to Aspen, anniversaries in Barcelona, business, conferences in Singapore. I followed their lives with interest and pride, though increasingly from a distance. Our phone calls grew shorter and less frequent. Visits became annual events rather than regular occurrences. When they did come to see us, it was often a brief stopover on the way to somewhere else, conversations punctuated by the chiming of cell phones and glances at watches. "They're busy, Ruthie," Thomas would remind me when I expressed hurt at a missed visit or forgotten birthday. Building careers takes time and focus. Remember how hard we worked at their age? We always made time for family, I would counter, but I tried not to dwell on it. After all, wasn't this what we'd wanted for Victor? Success, security, opportunities beyond what we could have provided? In 2018, they welcomed their first child, a daughter they named Lily. I knitted her a soft yellow blanket and matching booties, spending hours ensuring every stitch was perfect. When we visited the hospital, Charlotte looked remarkably composed for someone who had just given birth. Her hair arranged artfully on the pillow, a silk robe replacing the standard hospital gown. "Would you like to hold her?" Victor asked carefully, transferring the tiny bundle into my arms. The moment I looked into Lily's face, so small, so perfect, with Thomas's dimple already visible in her cheek, all my accumulated disappointments melted away. Here was a fresh start, a new chapter, a chance to rebuild the connections that had frayed over time. 2 years later, they had a son, Noah. Our grandchildren became the center of our world. I made photo albums documenting their growth, saved for special gifts, planned outings, and activities for when they visited. Thomas built a treehouse in our backyard and stocked up on toys and books to keep at our house. For a few golden years, it felt like we had reclaimed something precious. Victor and Charlotte were too busy with their careers to manage all the demands of parenthood without help, so they welcomed our involvement. I picked up Lily from preschool 3 days a week. Thomas taught Noah to identify different birds in our garden during school breaks. The children would stay with us, filling our home once again with laughter and sticky fingerprints and the wonderful chaos of young lives. Then came the winter of 2020, and with it, the diagnosis that would change everything. Thomas had been feeling tired for months, brushing off my concerns with reassurances about work stress and age catching up with him. When he finally agreed to see a doctor, the news was devastating. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer that had already spread to his liver. The prognosis was 6 months, perhaps a year with aggressive treatment. "It's not fair," I wept in Victor's arms when we called to tell him. "We were supposed to have more time." "We'll get through this, Mom," he promised, his voice steady though. I could hear the fear beneath it. "The firm has excellent medical insurance. We'll find the best specialists, explore every treatment option." True to his word, Victor arranged consultations with top oncologists, researched clinical trials, even investigated experimental treatments in Germany. For a few months, I allowed myself to hope, but Thomas's decline was swift and merciless. The chemotherapy ravaged his once strong body, leaving him frail and exhausted. The pain medications fogged his sharp mind. Through it all, he remained my Thomas, gentle, thoughtful, more concerned with my welfare than his own. "Promise me you'll still find joy, Ruthie," he made me swear one night, his hand gripping mine, with surprising strength. "Promise me you won't stop living when I'm gone." I made the promise, though I couldn't imagine how I would keep it. Thomas passed away on a quiet Sunday morning in April 2020, with me beside him holding his hand. He slipped away peacefully, the weight of suffering finally lifted from his shoulders. I felt his absence like a physical thing, a hollow space in the bed beside me, an echo in rooms that had once rung with his laughter, a shadow where his substance should have been. The world was already changing then, with the pandemic forcing everyone into isolation. My grief unfolded in a strange limbo, without the usual rituals and gatherings that might have provided some comfort. The funeral was small, socially distanced, nothing like the celebration of life that Thomas deserved. Victor flew in for 3 days, staying at a hotel rather than at the house, citing concerns about my age and vulnerability. Charlotte and the children remained in their gated community, sending flowers and a professionally designed memorial video. I understood the precautions, of course, but understanding didn't ease the loneliness of those first months without Thomas. I wandered our house like a ghost, touching his things, wearing his sweaters, sometimes talking to him as if he might answer. The silence that followed my words was deafening. Gradually, painfully, I found ways to keep moving forward. I volunteered to deliver meals to homebound seniors even more isolated than myself. I joined a virtual grief support group where I found comfort in the shared experiences of others who understood the particular ache of losing a lifelong partner. I planted a garden in Thomas's memory, filling it with all his favorite flowers, dahlias, hydrangeas, and the bright zinnias that bloomed from early summer until the first frost. As the world slowly reopened, I established new routines: Tuesday mornings at the community center for watercolor class, Thursday afternoons volunteering at the elementary school's reading program, Sunday dinners with my brother George and his wife, who lived across town. I made new friends, Harriet from my painting class, whose forthright humor reminded me of my mother, Philip, a retired English professor who shared my love of mystery novels, Maria and her husband Carlos, who ran the community garden and taught me how to properly compost. The hole in my heart where Thomas had been would never completely heal, but I was learning to live around it, to carry my grief as part of me rather than allowing it to consume me. I was keeping my promise to him, one day at a time. Victor and his family remained distant after Thomas's death, though we spoke on video calls every few weeks. The children were growing so quickly, developing interests and personalities that I glimpsed only in fragments. Lily's emerging talent for ballet, Noah's obsession with dinosaurs. I sent birthday gifts and holiday packages, carefully chosen, books, hand-knitted scarves, and small watercolor paintings I had created in my Tuesday morning class. These tangible expressions of love traveled across the distance between us, carrying messages my words could no longer seem to convey. When the invitation came to spend Christmas with them in 2021, I was overjoyed. It would be my first holiday without Thomas, and the thought of spending it with family rather than alone was a gift beyond measure. I prepared for weeks, shopping, for presents, baking Thomas's famous shortbread cookies from his grandmother's recipe, even buying a new dress for the occasion. The visit was not what I had hoped. Their home, while undeniably beautiful, felt like a showplace rather than a sanctuary. The children's toys were confined to a specially designated playroom, the kitchen gleamed with appliances that were never used, and they had a personal chef prepare most meals. Conversation revolved around investments, property values, and the achievements of people I'd never met. "Grandma, why don't you have someone clean your house?" Lily asked one afternoon, watching me wash dishes by hand after lunch. "Mom says it's inefficient to do housework yourself when your time could be better spent on self-improvement." "I find washing dishes rather meditative," I replied, smiling at my granddaughter's serious expression. "And it gives me time to think about nice memories, like when your daddy was little and would help me dry the plates." "Dad did chores?" Noah looked up from his tablet with genuine surprise. "Oh, yes," I laughed. "He was my best little helper. He used to stand on a stool right about where you're sitting now." For a moment, a connection flickered between us, a shared image of Victor as a small boy, so different from the polished attorney they knew. Then Charlotte called the children to their scheduled piano lesson, and the moment dissolved like morning mist in sunshine. That evening, as Victor and Charlotte entertained colleagues in their formal dining room, I sat alone in my guest room, missing Thomas with an intensity that took my breath away. "I'm trying," I whispered to his memory. "I'm trying to find my place in their world, but I'm not sure there is one." I returned home with a mixture of gratitude and relief. The visit had confirmed what I already suspected. Victor's life had moved in a direction that had little room for the values and traditions that had shaped our family. It wasn't that he didn't love me. It was that he had constructed a narrative of success that required distancing himself from his modest beginnings. In the years that followed, our contact continued to dwindle. Video calls became voice calls, which became text messages and occasional emails. The grandchildren's visits, once highlights of my summer, were replaced by coding camps and language immersion programs. When I suggested coming to stay with them, for a week, there was always some reason it wasn't convenient. Renovations, business trips, the children's packed schedules. I filled my days with meaningful activities and cultivated deeper relationships with friends who had become like family. I took classes at the community college, discovering a talent for watercolor painting that surprised and delighted me. I traveled a little, a weekend in New York with George and his wife, a guided tour of the Grand Canyon with my watercolor group, a Caribbean cruise with Harriet and some other friends from the senior center. It wasn't the life I had imagined for my 70th year, but it was rich and full in its own way. I missed Thomas every day, but I also found joy in the independence I'd never expected to have. I painted my kitchen a bold terracotta color that Thomas would have found too dramatic. I adopted a cat from the shelter despite having always been a dog person during our marriage. I rearranged furniture on a whim and ate ice cream for breakfast, occasionally because there was no one to tell me I shouldn't. Still, when holidays approached, the absence of family felt especially acute. I had created new traditions: Thanksgiving potluck with my grief support group, Christmas Eve dinner with George and his growing brood of grandchildren and great-grandchildren. But there remained a Victor-shaped hole in these gatherings, a space where my son and his children should have been. So when Victor's name appeared on my caller ID 3 weeks before Christmas, my heart lifted with hope. Perhaps this year would be different. Perhaps, finally, we would find our way back to each other across the gulf that had widened between us. "Hi, Mom." His voice sounded tight, formal. Not a good sign. "How are you doing?" "I'm well," I replied, keeping my tone light. "Just finished putting up the tree. I used all the old ornaments this year, including those popsicle stick frames you made in elementary school." "That's nice." He cleared his throat. "Listen, Mom, Charlotte wants to talk to you about Christmas. I'll put her on." Before I could respond, there was a shuffling sound, and Charlotte's crisp voice came through the line. "Ruth, hi, it's Charlotte." "Hello, Charlotte. How are you?" "Very busy, as always. The children's schedules are absolutely packed this season. Lily made the competitive dance team, and Noah is doing robotics club plus advanced math tutoring." "That's wonderful," I said, genuinely pleased to hear about their activities. "They're certainly accomplished kids." "Yes, well, we believe in maximizing potential." Her voice took on a brisker tone. "About Christmas, Victor and I have been discussing arrangements." My heart lifted. Finally, the invitation I'd been hoping for. I'd be happy to bring something. My cranberry chutney, perhaps, or I could make Thomas's shortbread cookies. The children used to love them. There was a pause, a small intake of breath. "Actually, Ruth, we've been thinking about the holiday arrangements. The thing is, we're hosting some of Victor's colleagues from work, people who could really help his path to senior partner. We need to make a good impression." "I understand, dear," I said. "Should I wear something special? I have that blue dress from George's daughter's wedding." "Actually," Charlotte cut in, "we think it's best if you skip Christmas dinner at our house this year. The dining room will be at capacity, and honestly, your hearing problems make conversation awkward for everyone." She paused, then added with false brightness, "Maybe you could have a nice quiet day at home. Watch the parade on TV." The words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. For a moment, I couldn't speak, couldn't process what I was hearing. Uninvited, unwelcome, an inconvenience to be managed rather than family to be embraced. The silence stretched between us. I wanted to protest, to remind her that these holidays weren't just gatherings, but the threads that held our family's tapestry together. Instead, I heard myself say, "I see. Well, you do what you think is best." "Wonderful," Charlotte said, sounding relieved. "I knew you'd understand." "Oh, and the children will be quite busy with school activities, so maybe hold off on calling them for a bit." They're under so much pressure these days. Not just excluded from the holiday then, but effectively cut off from my grandchildren as, well, the completeness of the rejection was stunning in its casual cruelty. Is Victor there? I asked, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. I'd like to speak with him. He had to step into another call, Charlotte replied smoothly. Client emergency that couldn't wait. I'll tell him you understand about Christmas. Yes, do that, I said, a strange calm settling over me. Tell him I understand perfectly. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, watching. The afternoon light fade to dusk. The house that had once bustled with life and laughter felt suddenly empty, hollow. Was this what the rest of my days would be? Quiet afternoons blending into silent evenings, waiting for phone calls that never came? Gradually being erased from my own family's story? I made myself a cup of tea, mechanically following the ritual, filling the kettle, selecting a bag of Earl Grey, Thomas's favorite, warming the pot, waiting for the proper steeping time. The familiar actions anchored me somewhat, though my hands trembled slightly as I poured. Murph, my orange tabby, jumped onto the table, something he knew was technically not allowed, but that I often permitted when we were alone. He butted his head against my hand, purring loudly as if sensing my distress. Well, Murph, I said, scratching behind his ears, it seems it's just you and me for Christmas this year. The words, spoken aloud, made the reality sink in more deeply. Just me, alone on the holiday that had always been about family, about gratitude, about coming together across distances and differences to celebrate our connections. Now deemed too boring, too inconvenient, too old-fashioned to include in the sleek, impressive gathering my son and his wife were planning. Not family enough. For a family holiday. The hurt was profound, cutting to the very core of my identity. Who was I if not the mother, the grandmother, the keeper of traditions and connections? What was my place in the world if not alongside the people I had loved and nurtured across decades? I must have sat there for hours, my tea growing cold. Murphy, eventually abandoning me for his food bowl. The darkness outside deepening until the kitchen window reflected nothing but my own solitary figure at the table. When I finally rose, my body stiff from sitting too long, I moved through the house like a sleepwalker, touching familiar objects as if to reassure myself of their solidity, the mantel clock Thomas had inherited from his father, the quilt my mother had made for our wedding, the wall of family photographs chronicling birthdays, graduations, vacations, moments when we had been truly together, truly connected. I paused before the portrait taken on our 40th anniversary. Thomas and I standing beneath the oak tree in the backyard, his arm around my waist, both of us smiling with the easy confidence of people who knew their place in each other's hearts. What would you do, Thomas? I whispered to his image. How would you handle this? Of course, there was no answer. Just the ticking of the mantel clock, the distant sound of a car passing on the street, the soft padding of Murph returning to wind around my ankles. That night, I couldn't sleep. I paced my living room until dawn, looking at the photographs that chronicled my life. Thomas and I on our wedding day, Victor taking his first steps, family vacations, graduations, celebrations. A lifetime of love and sacrifice and joy. And now, at 70, I was being told I was no longer needed, no longer wanted. As the first light of dawn crept through my curtains, something shifted inside me. A quiet voice that sounded remarkably like Thomas's whispered in my heart, "Ruthie, you've never been one to give up. Don't start now." I stood at the window, watching the neighborhood slowly come to life. Mr. Peterson retrieving his newspaper from the driveway, Mrs. Lindholm's lights coming on in her kitchen, a jogger passing with a golden retriever trotting happily beside her. Life continuing in its ordinary patterns while mine seemed suddenly adrift. But was it really? Was I really so powerless, so dependent on Victor and Charlotte's approval for my happiness? Hadn't I built a rich life for myself in the years since Thomas's death, filled with meaningful activities and genuine connections? I thought of Harriet from my painting class, with her infectious laugh and no-nonsense wisdom. Philip from the library book club, whose insights into literature had opened new worlds for me. Maria and Carlos, who had welcomed me into their gardening community with open arms. My brother George and his wife Helen, who called every Sunday without fail. Perhaps being excluded from Victor's Christmas table wasn't the end of something, but an opportunity to create something new. Something authentically mine. The idea came, to me suddenly, fully formed, as I stood watching the sunrise paint my garden with golden light. If I couldn't join their Christmas celebration, I would create my own. Not a sad, solitary meal in front of the television, but a true gathering, a coming together of the people who had become my chosen family, who appreciated me, not despite my age and quirks, but because of them. The more I considered it, the more right it felt. My house on Cedar Lane had always been a place of welcome, of comfort, of connection. That didn't need to end just because my son had chosen a different path. Would host Christmas dinner, not as a replacement for what I had lost, but as an affirmation of what I had found. Not in competition with Victor and Charlotte's elegant affair, but as a genuine expression of gratitude for the unexpected gifts life had brought me, even in the midst of loss. The tension that had gripped me since Charlotte's call began to ease, replaced by a sense of purpose and, surprisingly, a flicker of excitement. I hadn't hosted a large gathering since before Thomas's death. The prospect was both daunting and exhilarating. I would need to plan carefully, the menu, the guest list, the preparations. But first, I needed my morning coffee. Life-changing decisions were best contemplated with caffeine, as Thomas used to say. As I measured coffee grounds into the filter, I felt a lightness I hadn't expected. Whatever came next, whether my impromptu Christmas dinner was a success or a disaster, whether Victor ever recognized what he had cast aside or continued down his separate path, I would face it on my own terms. Not as someone discarded, but as someone choosing a new way forward. That was the gift hidden within Charlotte's cruel words. The push I needed to stop waiting for permission to matter, to stop making my happiness contingent on others' approval. At 70 years old, it was well past time to fully claim my own life. I carried my coffee to the back porch, settling into the wicker chair that offered the best view of my garden. The late autumn landscape was spare but beautiful, dried hydrangea, blossoms in deep bronze, ornamental grasses catching the morning light, a few stubborn roses still blooming against the odds. Like me, I thought with a small smile. Still blooming, still reaching for the light, regardless of the season. The phone call from Charlotte had been like a stone thrown into still water, sending ripples through every aspect of my carefully constructed life. For 3 days afterward, I moved through my routine in a fog of hurt and disbelief, going through the motions but feeling strangely disconnected from everything around me. I attended my watercolor class but couldn't focus, the colors bleeding together on the page in ways I hadn't intended. Philip noticed immediately, pausing beside my easel with a concerned frown. "Everything all right, Ruth? This doesn't look like your usual work." I forced a smile. "Just experimenting with a looser style today." He didn't believe me, I could tell, by the way his eyebrows drew together. But he was kind enough not to press the issue in front of the others. Instead, he squeezed my shoulder gently and moved on to the next student, leaving me to stare at the chaotic mess of pigment that somehow perfectly reflected my inner state. At home, I found myself avoiding certain rooms: the dining room where we'd hosted so many family Christmases, the guest bedroom where I'd already set out fresh towels in anticipation of a visit from the grandchildren. Even my garden, usually my sanctuary, offered little comfort. The holly bushes I'd pruned with Christmas centerpieces in mind now seemed to mock my naive assumptions about family and belonging. Murph followed me from room to room, uncharacteristically attentive, as if sensing my distress. Animals have a way of knowing, don't they? A wisdom that doesn't require words. On the third night after the call, I found myself standing in front of my closet, staring at the blue dress I'd mentioned to Charlotte, the one I'd thought might be appropriate for her elegant Christmas gathering. It was a lovely thing, silk and chiffon in a shade that matched my eyes, with delicate beading at the neckline. George had insisted I buy it for his daughter's wedding, despite my protests about the expense. "You deserve beautiful things, Ruthie," he'd said firmly. "Thomas would want you to have them." I ran my fingers over the cool fabric, remembering how it had felt to wear something so fine, to receive compliments and admiring glances, to feel, however briefly, that I still belonged in the world of celebration and connection, rather than the margins to which age and widowhood had gradually relegated me. With sudden decision, I took the dress from its hanger and laid it carefully on my bed. Then I began to pull other items from my closet and dresser, my good pearl earrings, the silk scarf Thomas had given me for our 30th anniversary, shoes I'd been saving for special occasions that rarely materialized. I spread these treasures across my bedspread, creating a kind of inventory of beauty that I'd been holding in reserve, waiting for permission to enjoy. How foolish. How wasteful. Life was too short and too precious to save the best parts for someday. "No more waiting," I said aloud, startling Murph from his position on my pillow. "No more making myself small to fit into spaces others design. For me." That night, for the first time since the call, I slept deeply and without interruption. When I woke the next morning, the fog of hurt had lifted, replaced by a clarity and resolve that felt both new and familiar. New in its focus, familiar, because it connected me to the woman I had been before grief and exclusion had diminished my sense of agency. Over breakfast, I made my first list: guests for my Christmas gathering, Harriet from my grief group, Philip from the library book club, Maria and Carlos from the community garden, Mrs. Lindholm from next door, the Changs from across the street with their 2 children, George and Helen, of course, and Patricia and Robert from the grief group. Mr. Foster, if his arthritis was manageable that day, perhaps some of the other teachers from the elementary school where I volunteered. Looking at the names, I felt a surge of gratitude. These weren't just acquaintances or activities partners. These were people who saw me clearly, who valued what I offered, who had created space for me in their lives not out of obligation, but out of genuine connection. The second list was for the menu. If I was reclaiming Christmas, I would reclaim the foods that made the holiday meaningful to me. Roast duck, of course, though a smaller one than in years past. Thomas's bread pudding, my cranberry chutney, sweet potato souffle with the pecan topping, green beans with slivered almonds. Dinner, rolls from my mother's recipe,